At Thanksgiving dinner, my mother smirked. "You're not getting a single cent of the inheritance." Everyone laughed. I calmly opened my leather folder and slid 3 documents across the table. When they realized who bought it, the room went completely silent. A second earlier, my older brother had been grinning like he'd just won the lottery. My mother looked so pleased with herself that she didn't even try to hide it. A few relatives were already exchanging amused looks, waiting for me to react the way they expected. To argue, to cry, to beg. Instead, I simply rested my hand on the leather folder in front of me. I didn't rush. I didn't raise my voice. I just watched their expressions, because for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't the one walking into a family dinner unprepared. Before I tell you what happened after those 3 documents touched the table, welcome to Van's Rock Stories. If you've ever been treated like you didn't matter until someone wanted something from you, this story might hit closer to home than you expect. As you listen, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments. And if you enjoy real-life family drama stories with unexpected twists, don't forget to subscribe. It really helps the channel, and I'd love to have you here for more stories like this. Now let me take you back to where all of this actually began. My name is Emily Harper. I'm 35 years old, and I'm a CPA. Most people hear that and picture someone buried under spreadsheets all day. They're not completely wrong. I specialize in accounting for family-owned farms around Maple Ridge. I've spent years helping people save businesses that had been passed down through generations. Numbers tell stories, contracts tell stories. And sometimes, those stories are a lot more honest than people. That's probably why I never believed family conflicts were won by yelling the loudest. They're won by patience, by paperwork, and by knowing exactly when to stop talking. My family never understood that. To them, I was just the quiet daughter who worked with calculators while everyone else talked about real work. My older brother liked to joke that I could probably calculate the value of an apple before taking a bite out of it. Everyone laughed, including my mother. I usually laughed too. It was easier that way. By the time Thanksgiving came around, those little jokes had turned into something much uglier. Dinner started like every other holiday meal. Too much food, too many opinions, everyone talking over each other. For a while, I almost convinced myself we could get through the evening without anyone bringing up Grandpa Walter's orchard. I should have known better. My brother raised his glass first. "Here's to finally closing the deal," he said proudly. "Grandpa's place is officially sold." Several people clapped. Someone even joked that the money would make Christmas shopping a lot easier this year. Then my mother looked straight at me. She smiled. Not the kind of smile that says she's happy to see you, the kind that says she's been waiting for this moment. "Well," she said, taking a slow sip of her wine, "at least nobody can accuse us of being unfair anymore." The table grew quieter. She kept looking at me. "You were never supposed to get a single cent of the inheritance anyway." A few relatives chuckled. One of my cousins actually laughed out loud. Nobody told them to stop. Nobody changed the subject. My father stared down at his plate. He didn't defend me. He didn't even look at me. I remember thinking how strange it was that humiliation could become such a normal family tradition. My brother leaned back in his chair with that satisfied smile he'd perfected over the years. "I guess it's time to move on, Em." Move on. Like 7 years of showing up for Grandpa could be erased with 2 words. I didn't answer. I slowly placed both hands on the leather folder I'd brought with me. It wasn't thick. Just 3 documents inside. Nothing more. Nothing less. My mother noticed the folder. "So," she asked with a little laugh, "what's that supposed to be?" I met her eyes. For the first time that evening, I smiled back. Not because I'd won. Not yet. Because I already knew something no one else at that table knew. And to understand why I didn't say a single word that night, You need to know what happened almost a year earlier. I was in the middle of reviewing payroll reports for one of my farm clients when my phone started vibrating across my desk. The caller ID showed Maple Ridge Hospice. My stomach tightened before I even answered. Emily Harper? A gentle voice asked. Yes. I'm calling about your grandfather, Walter. His condition has changed this morning. We think it would be a good idea if you came when you can. She didn't say anything dramatic. She didn't have to. I thanked her, closed my laptop without saving what I was working on, grabbed my keys, and left the office. I texted my assistant that I wouldn't be back that day. No explanation. She already knew. Whenever Grandpa needed me, everything else could wait. The drive to his orchard usually felt peaceful. That afternoon, every red light felt personal. I kept glancing at my phone, expecting another call. None came. By the time I pulled into the gravel driveway, the place looked exactly the way it always had. Rows of apple trees stretched across the hillside. The old red barn leaned just enough to make first-time visitors nervous. Grandpa used to joke that the barn had been standing longer than half the people in town, and it planned to outlive the other half too. I smiled without meaning to. It was strange how some places could calm you down even when your heart was racing. Inside the farmhouse, everything smelled familiar. Fresh coffee, old books, wood that had soaked up decades of winters. A nurse looked up as I stepped through the front door. You made it, she said quietly. Is he awake? She nodded. He's been asking if you'd gotten here yet. Not whether anyone had called my mother, not whether my brother was coming. Me. I found him sitting in his favorite chair by the window instead of lying in bed. A blanket covered his legs, and he looked thinner than he'd ever been, but the second he saw me, he lifted one eyebrow. Took you long enough, he said. I laughed. I drove as fast as I legally could. So, slow. You're impossible. I've been told that. His smile wasn't as strong as it used to be, but it was still there. I pulled another chair beside him. For a while, we didn't talk about doctors or hospice or how tired he looked. We talked about the orchard. He asked whether the late frost had damaged the northern trees. I showed him pictures I'd taken earlier that week. He studied every photo like he was inspecting them in person. Those branches need pruning. I already scheduled it. I knew you would. That simple sentence meant more to me than he probably realized. People always assumed I helped because I was single, or because I was the responsible one. The truth was simpler. I wanted to be there. For almost 7 years, visiting Grandpa had become part of my routine. Some weeks, it was every day. Other weeks, 3 or 4 times. I'd refill his prescriptions, organize insurance paperwork, balance the orchard's books, call repair companies when equipment broke down, and stop by the grocery store before coming over. None of it ever felt like a burden. It was just life. Sometimes we'd spend an hour talking. Sometimes we'd barely say 10 words. Either way, I left feeling like I'd spent time with someone who actually noticed I was there. Grandpa noticed everything. If I looked tired, he'd ask whether I was working too much. If I skipped lunch, somehow he'd know before I admitted it. If I bought him a different brand of coffee, he'd tease me for trying to ruin him. You know, he said that afternoon, staring out the window, people think taking care of a farm is hard. It is. He shook his head. No, taking care of people is harder. I didn't know what to say to that. So I reached over and adjusted the blanket that had slipped off his knee. He patted my hand once before letting it go. A few minutes later, one of the nurses stepped inside to check his medication. Grandpa immediately complained. I think she's trying to keep me alive forever. The nurse laughed. I've heard worse complaints. I had better material yesterday. You did. Watching them joke with each other made it obvious how much everyone there cared about him. Before leaving the room, the nurse glanced at me. Could I borrow you for a second? I followed her into the hallway. She lowered her voice, almost like she didn't want Grandpa to hear. I hope you know how much these visits mean to him. I try to come as often as I can. She gave me a small smile. You don't have to try very hard. I looked at her, confused. She hesitated for a moment before saying softly, "He always tells us there's only one person who truly comes to see him." The nurse's words stayed with me long after she walked away. There was only one person who truly came to see him. I didn't know whether that made me feel proud or heartbroken. Probably both. I went back into the living room pretending nothing had happened. Grandpa looked up from the crossword puzzle resting on his lap. "She told you I'm the easiest patient they've ever had, didn't she?" I laughed. "I don't think anyone has ever described you as easy." "That's disappointing." He folded the newspaper and pointed toward the kitchen. "Coffee? I'll make it." "You always make it too weak. You complain every single time. And yet you keep coming back." "I must enjoy being criticized." "I knew you were smarter than your brother." I rolled my eyes. "There it is." "What?" "The unnecessary comparison." "It wasn't unnecessary." He gave me that little grin that usually meant he was about to say something outrageous. "I only compare people when one of them deserves to win." I shook my head. "You really shouldn't start family arguments while you're in hospice." "I don't start them." "You absolutely do. They just finish themselves." By the time the coffee was ready, he had somehow convinced me to bring out an old ledger from one of the kitchen cabinets. The cover was worn smooth from years of use. Every page was filled with neat handwriting, dates, harvest numbers, equipment repairs, weather notes, tiny observations that probably wouldn't mean much to anyone else. Grandpa flipped through a few pages before handing it to me. "Read the margin." I looked closer. Next to an entry about a poor apple harvest, he'd written one sentence: "Never make decisions based on one bad season." I smiled. "You wrote business advice in the middle of farm records?" "Where else was I supposed to keep it?" "You could have bought a notebook." "Too easy." That was Grandpa. He had a lesson hidden inside almost everything. When I first started my accounting firm years earlier, I thought he'd teach me about taxes and bookkeeping. Instead, he taught me patience. He'd ask questions I couldn't answer with numbers. "What happens if your client has a good year?" "They make money." "And then?" "They invest." "And then?" "They prepare for the bad year." He'd nod every time. Exactly. Running a business wasn't just about making money. It was about surviving long enough to make good decisions. I still used that advice every day. Sometimes I'd stop by after meeting with clients just to tell him about a difficult situation. He never told me what to do. He'd simply ask questions until I figured it out myself. "You already know the answer," he'd say. "You just don't trust yourself yet." No professor had ever taught me that. No accounting textbook had either. We spent another hour looking through old records, not because the orchard needed them anymore, because Grandpa enjoyed remembering. "This tractor broke down 3 times in one summer," he said, tapping a page. "I remember. You cried." "I was 12. You cried a lot." "I also fixed it." Eventually, I nudged his shoulder. "You really know how to encourage people." "I kept you humble." "You definitely tried." For a little while, hospice didn't feel like hospice. It just felt like another afternoon at the farmhouse. The same old jokes, the same coffee, the same stubborn man pretending everything was perfectly normal. As the sun drifted lower outside the window, Grandpa grew quieter. He watched the orchard for a long moment. Rows of apple trees stretched across the hill, their branches moving gently in the breeze. "You know what people get wrong?" he asked. "What?" "They think this place is about apples." I looked out the window. "It isn't?" He shook his head. "No. It's about people willing to show up every season. He rested both hands on the armrests of his chair before speaking again. Anybody can enjoy a good harvest. He paused. The hard part is staying through the winters. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. There wasn't anything to add. He'd already said what mattered. Then his expression softened. He looked toward the orchard again, almost as if he were talking to the trees instead of me. One day, he said quietly, all of this will keep living. He turned back and met my eyes. If it ends up with the right person. Grandpa's words stayed with me the rest of the afternoon. Neither of us mentioned them again. Instead, we finished our coffee, argued over whether the orchard needed another fertilizer order before winter, and laughed because he insisted I still bought the wrong brand every single time. It almost felt normal. Then I heard a car pull into the driveway. Grandpa glanced toward the window. Looks like your mother's here. I hadn't seen her at the orchard in weeks. My older brother climbed out of the passenger side carrying a grocery bag that looked like it had come straight from a convenience store. Mom walked in first. There you are, she said, with a bright smile that seemed just a little too rehearsed. She leaned down and gave Grandpa a quick hug before stepping back almost immediately. How are you feeling today? I've been worse. You look good. Grandpa chuckled. That's a generous lie. She laughed politely. My brother set the grocery bag on the kitchen counter. Picked up some snacks. Grandpa looked inside. Crackers, a couple cans of soup. Cookies he wasn't even allowed to eat anymore. Thanks, he said anyway. The room settled into one of those awkward silences families pretend not to notice. Mom broke it first. So, have the neighbors still been asking about the property? I looked up. Grandpa answered without much interest. A few. I heard land around here has gone way up. It has. My brother pulled out his phone. I actually looked it up. Of course he had. They're building new subdivisions 20 minutes from here. If developers move this direction... He whistled. This place could be worth a fortune. Grandpa didn't respond. He simply reached for his coffee. My brother kept going. 12 acres? Plus the farmhouse? Somebody would pay serious money. I finally spoke. Can we maybe talk about something besides appraisals? He looked at me like I'd interrupted something important. What? We're just having a conversation. Grandpa smiled faintly. I'd rather hear about Emily's work. Mom waved a hand. Oh, accounting isn't very exciting. I couldn't help smiling. You'd be surprised. My brother laughed. No offense, Em, but spreadsheets aren't exactly thrilling dinner conversation. They're more interesting than property values. That earned me a look from Mom. Emily. What? There's no reason to be defensive. I wasn't. Grandpa quietly changed the subject before it could turn into an argument. He asked my brother how work was going. For a few minutes, everything relaxed again. They talked about traffic, rising gas prices, and a fishing trip my brother wanted to take. Then, almost casually, my brother circled back. So, have you ever thought about selling the orchard? Grandpa looked at him. No. Not even if someone made a really good offer? No. What if nobody in the family wanted to run it? Grandpa smiled politely. That's a lot of what-ifs. I was just curious. I know. The conversation drifted away again, but only for a little while. Before they left, my brother wandered over to the window overlooking the orchard. You know, he said, maintenance on all this has to be expensive. It is. And property taxes aren't exactly getting cheaper. No. So financially, he shrugged. Selling eventually would make sense. Grandpa folded his hands together. Not everything that makes financial sense is the right decision. Nobody answered. Mom picked up her purse. We should let you rest. She kissed Grandpa on the forehead, promised she'd visit again soon, and headed for the door. My brother followed behind her. As they reached the porch, I overheard him say quietly, "I still think it's worth more than he realizes." Mom didn't answer. She simply closed the front door behind them. Their car disappeared down the gravel road. The farmhouse became quiet again. I started gathering the empty coffee mugs from the table, expecting Grandpa to make another joke or ask about my clients. He didn't. When I looked over, he was still staring out the front window toward the road they'd just taken. He didn't say a single word. He only let out one long, tired sigh. Grandpa stayed quiet for another minute before looking over at me. "Don't worry about them." I set the coffee mugs in the sink. "I'm not." He gave me a look that said he knew better. "You've always been a terrible liar." I thought I was getting better. Nope. That finally made both of us laugh. The tension from a few minutes earlier eased just enough for the house to feel familiar again. Grandpa reached toward the stack of folders sitting on the end of the table. Since everyone's suddenly interested in what this place is worth, he slid one of the folders toward me. "Let's do something actually useful." Inside were invoices, receipts, equipment maintenance records, and the orchard's monthly income reports. I smiled. "You've been saving these for me?" "I've been trying. You know I would have organized them either way." "I know." For the next hour, we worked the way we always had. I checked invoices while Grandpa explained which tractor needed another repair before spring. I balanced the operating expenses while he argued that fertilizer prices had become ridiculous. Every few minutes he'd interrupt himself to tell a story that had absolutely nothing to do with bookkeeping. Somehow, those stories always ended up explaining the numbers anyway. People like to joke that I inherited my love of spreadsheets from nowhere. The truth was sitting across the table from me. Grandpa never had formal accounting training. He just understood businesses. He believed every dollar had a job, every decision had a consequence, and every shortcut eventually showed up somewhere else. Those lessons shaped the way I built my own firm. I still remember sitting at this exact table almost 8 years earlier with a business plan spread out between us. I wanted to leave my corporate accounting job and start my own practice. Everyone else thought I was making a mistake. Mom called it risky. My brother called it unrealistic. One aunt actually suggested I wait until I found a more stable husband before making a decision that big. Grandpa listened to all of them. Then he waited until everyone had gone home. "So," he asked me, "what do you want?" "I want my own clients." "Why?" "I want to build something that's mine." He nodded once. "Good answer." That was it. No lecture, no warning, just one simple question. A week later, he invited me back to the farmhouse. He opened an old metal cash box and placed a check on the table. I stared at it. "Grandpa, it's a loan. I can't take this." "You can." "What if my business fails?" He shrugged. "Then you pay me back slower." "And if I can't?" He leaned back in his chair like the answer was obvious. "Then I'll still have a granddaughter." I laughed because I didn't know what else to do. "I don't even have an office yet." "You'll figure that out." "I don't have enough clients." "You'll find them." "You sound very confident." "I am." "Why?" He looked almost offended that I'd even asked. "Because I've watched you solve problems since you were 10 years old. That check changed my life. I paid every dollar back over the next 4 years, exactly the way we'd agreed." The day I handed him the final payment, he pushed the envelope back toward me. "Keep it." "No." "You've already proven what I wanted. I borrowed it. And you honored your word. I still owe you." He smiled. "Not anymore." Back in the present, I finished entering the orchard's latest expenses into my laptop. Grandpa leaned over to peek at the screen. "I still don't understand how you read all those tiny numbers." "I've been asking myself the same thing about your handwriting." "My handwriting has character. It has mysteries." He laughed harder than I'd heard him laugh in weeks. For a few seconds, he didn't look like a hospice patient. He just looked like my grandfather, the one who believed I could do more than anyone else ever expected. The room grew quiet again. Grandpa slowly turned toward the old wooden desk beside his chair. He opened the top drawer and searched through it carefully. His fingers stopped on something hidden near the back. He looked down at it for a long moment. But instead of handing it to me, he gently closed the drawer again. I couldn't stop thinking about that drawer. Grandpa noticed. "You've been looking at it for 5 minutes. I was wondering what was in there." "So was I." I laughed. "No, you weren't." "No," he admitted with a grin. "I know exactly what's in there. You like making people curious. I've had a lot of practice." The conversation drifted to lighter things again. We talked about a local diner that had somehow managed to burn toast 3 mornings in a row. He insisted the waitress was innocent. "The cook's the problem. You've never even met the cook." "I don't need to. That's not how evidence works." "It is when you're 84. I shook my head. "You're impossible. And yet you keep visiting." That part was true. Over the next couple of days, I came by whenever work allowed. Some visits lasted an hour, some barely 20 minutes. Sometimes Grandpa was awake and joking with the nurses. Sometimes he slept through most of my visit while I quietly sorted mail or paid bills at the kitchen table. Those ordinary moments became strangely important. I'd refill the bird feeder outside his window because he liked watching cardinals in the morning. I'd replace burned-out light bulbs before he noticed. I'd check the calendar hanging in the pantry and make sure every medical appointment was written down, even though there weren't many left. Nobody asked me to do those things. I just did them. One afternoon, I found him watching an old baseball game on television. "I'm pretty sure you've seen this one before." "I have." "You already know who wins." "I do. So why watch it again?" He smiled without taking his eyes off the screen. "Because sometimes the ending isn't the reason you come back." That sounded like Grandpa, always answering one question while secretly talking about something else. 3 days before he passed away, I almost skipped my visit. One of my biggest clients had called with an emergency audit issue, and my phone hadn't stopped ringing all morning. I considered sending flowers instead. The thought lasted maybe 5 seconds. I finished what absolutely couldn't wait, then drove to the orchard. When I walked in, Grandpa was sitting by the window again. He looked more tired than I'd ever seen him. Even his jokes came slower. "You almost didn't come today." I stopped. "How did you know that?" "I know your face." "My face?" "You've got your office face." "I have an office face?" "You do." "I'd really like to know what that looks like." "Like someone who's been arguing with numbers." I laughed. "I was. I figured." I pulled my chair closer. For a while we didn't say much. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It never had been between us. Finally, he reached toward the same desk drawer I'd been staring at a few days earlier. This time he opened it without saying anything. He searched carefully, moving a few old envelopes aside before picking up a small brass key attached to a worn leather tag. He held it in his hand for a second before offering it to me. I frowned. "What's this for?" "Keep it. Grandpa. Just take it." His voice wasn't weak. It was steady. The kind of tone he used when he'd already made up his mind. I accepted the key and turned it over in my hand. The brass was cool against my fingers. The leather tag was faded with age, but it had clearly been handled many times. "There has to be an explanation." "There is." I waited. Instead, he leaned back in his chair. "When they're finished talking." He paused to catch his breath. "Open the cedar box." I blinked. "The cedar box?" He nodded once. "The old one." "I don't know which one you mean." "You will." I looked down at the key again. "Shouldn't I open it now?" "No." "Why not?" "Because it isn't time." I searched his face, hoping he'd explain. He didn't. The room stayed quiet except for the soft ticking of the old clock hanging above the fireplace. I slipped the key into my pocket anyway. It felt heavier than something that small should have. Before I left that evening, I touched his shoulder. "I'll be back tomorrow." He smiled. "I know." Driving home, I reached into my coat pocket at nearly every red light just to make sure the key was still there. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I took it out again and stared at the worn leather tag. I had no idea what the cedar box was, or why Grandpa had been so certain I wasn't supposed to open it yet. My phone rang just after sunrise. I already knew why before I answered. The hospice nurse didn't rush through the conversation. She spoke gently. "I'm so sorry, Emily." I closed my eyes. "What time?" "A little after 5 this morning." I thanked her, hung up, and sat perfectly still for a few seconds. The apartment was quiet. The coffee maker was still running in the kitchen. Outside, people were driving to work like it was any other weekday. It felt strange how the world could keep moving when yours had just stopped. I picked up my keys without thinking. Halfway to the orchard, I called my mother. She answered on the third ring. "I know," she said before I could speak. "The hospice already called." "I'm heading there." "So are we." That was the entire conversation. When I arrived, the nurses were waiting near the front porch. One of them hugged me before saying anything. "I'm glad you came." "So am I." Grandpa looked peaceful. That was the first thing I noticed. His room was exactly the way we'd left it. The crossword puzzle was still folded beside his chair. His reading glasses rested on the little table near the window. Nothing looked dramatic. Just unfinished. I stayed with him for a while. I don't know how long. Long enough to say goodbye. Long enough to thank him for things I'd never managed to say out loud. The rest of the day became a blur of phone calls, paperwork, and decisions. The funeral home needed information. The church wanted a schedule. Someone had to choose flowers. Someone had to contact relatives. Without really discussing it, everyone seemed to assume I'd handle most of it. And honestly, I did. I knew which hymns Grandpa liked. I knew the blue suit he always said he wanted to be buried in. I knew the names of friends he hadn't seen in years but would have wanted invited. Those weren't difficult decisions. They were just things I'd learned from showing up. Mom and my brother came and went throughout the afternoon. They helped with a few phone calls, but they mostly asked practical questions. "How many people do you think will come?" "Did the funeral home give you a price yet?" "What time should everyone meet?" Normal questions, I told myself. People grieve differently. I tried not to judge. The visitation was held 2 days later. The line of people stretched farther than I expected. Farmers, neighbors, former employees, people I'd never even met. Nearly every conversation sounded the same. Walter was a good man. He always kept his word. He helped us when nobody else would. I heard those sentences over and over. Each one made me smile a little. Each one also made me miss him even more. Several people stopped to tell me how often they'd seen my car parked at the orchard. One elderly couple thanked me for helping Grandpa stay on the farm instead of moving into a facility years earlier. I hadn't realized anyone noticed. Apparently, they had. My mother stood nearby greeting guests. My brother shook hands and accepted condolences. From a distance, we probably looked like any other grieving family. Up close, it felt different. One thing kept bothering me. Not a single person in my family asked me about Grandpa's final week. Nobody asked whether he'd been comfortable. Nobody wondered what he'd talked about. Nobody asked if he'd said anything before he passed. The only people who cared about those answers were the nurses. That thought stayed with me through the funeral service. Afterward, everyone gathered in the fellowship hall for coffee and sandwiches. Conversation slowly shifted away from memories. Someone mentioned property taxes. Another relative talked about rising land values around Maple Ridge. I carried a tray of empty coffee cups toward the kitchen, trying not to listen. Then I heard my brother's voice behind me. He wasn't whispering. He wasn't exactly hiding it either. Well? He let out a slow breath. Now all that's left is figuring out the division. I stopped walking. The tray suddenly felt much heavier in my hands. Nobody responded to what my brother said. Not because they disagreed, because it sounded like the conversation everyone had been waiting to have. An uncle nodded once. One of my cousins quietly asked, "Do you know when the paperwork starts?" I walked into the kitchen before I heard the answer. I wasn't angry. Not exactly. Mostly, I was tired. Tired of hearing Grandpa's life reduced to numbers before we'd even finished saying goodbye. I stood at the sink rinsing coffee cups until one of the church volunteers gently touched my shoulder. "You don't have to do all this yourself?" "I know. You've been taking care of everyone for days." I smiled. "It keeps my hands busy." She understood what I meant. Sometimes staying busy is easier than standing still. Over the next week, life slowly tried to return to normal. I went back to my accounting office. Clients still needed payroll processed. Quarterly reports still had deadlines. Farmers still called because tractors broke down or invoices didn't match. The world doesn't pause because your heart does. A few times I almost drove to the orchard after work out of pure habit. I'd catch myself halfway there before remembering there wasn't anyone waiting by the window anymore. That realization never got easier. I still stopped by the property every few days. The grass kept growing, the mailbox kept filling with advertisements. The orchard didn't know Grandpa was gone. In a strange way, that comforted me. One afternoon, I found my mother standing inside the farmhouse. She was carrying a cardboard box filled with folders. "Oh," she said, sounding surprised to see me. "I didn't know you were coming. I just wanted to check on the place." She nodded. "I'm organizing everything." I looked at the box. "What kind of everything?" "Paperwork." She said it casually, as if it were obvious. "Insurance files, tax records, bank statements, property documents." "I can help." "I've already got it." "I know where most of those files are." "So do I." Her answer came a little too quickly. She taped the top of the box shut before I could even see what was inside. "I'll sort through it at home." I frowned. "Wouldn't it make more sense to leave the originals here until the estate is settled?" "They'll be safer with me." I didn't argue, not because I agreed, because I wasn't sure what argument I could make without sounding suspicious. She picked up another stack from Grandpa's desk. I noticed one of his old financial binders underneath. "I still need those records for the orchard's bookkeeping. I'll bring them back if anyone needs them." "If?" She paused. "I mean, when?" The correction felt awkward. She forced a small smile. "We're all trying to figure things out." "I know." For a second it looked like she wanted to say something else. Instead, she carried the box outside. I watched from the front window as she loaded it into the trunk of her car. There were already 2 more boxes inside. I hadn't realized she'd been doing this before I arrived. By the time she drove away, Grandpa's office looked different. Not empty, just picked over. Drawers were open. Several shelves had gaps where binders used to be. Even the little basket that normally held incoming mail was gone. I walked through the farmhouse one room at a time, mostly to make sure everything else was still there. His favorite jacket still hung behind the kitchen door. The old radio was sitting on the counter. His reading glasses were exactly where he'd left them. Those small things made the house feel familiar again. As I locked the front door, I slipped the brass key from my pocket for a moment. I still hadn't found the cedar box he'd mentioned. Part of me wondered if I was looking in the wrong place. Another part remembered exactly what he'd told me. Not yet. so I put the key away again. A few days passed without hearing much from anyone. Then, late one afternoon, an envelope arrived in my mailbox. My name was typed neatly across the front. Inside was a formal notice requesting my presence for the reading of Walter Harper's last will and testament. The meeting was scheduled for the following week. For the first time since the funeral, everyone in my family would be sitting around the same table again. The conference room was smaller than I expected. It wasn't a courtroom or anything dramatic. Just a quiet office with a polished wooden table, bottled water, and a wall lined with framed legal certificates. Everyone had arrived before me. Mom was sitting beside my brother, chatting quietly. A couple of relatives were there too, along with my father, who looked unusually quiet. Grant Ellis stood near the front of the room, organizing a stack of folders. I'd known Grant for years. He wasn't family, but he'd handled real estate closings around Maple Ridge for as long as I could remember. He'd even attended a few community events with Grandpa over the years. "Emily," he said as I walked in, "glad you could make it." "I wouldn't miss it." He smiled politely, though something about it felt rehearsed. I took the last empty chair. Nobody said much. The atmosphere wasn't emotional anymore. It felt administrative. Grant cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming." He spent several minutes explaining probate procedures and how estates are typically handled. Most of it was standard legal language. I listened, but my attention kept drifting toward the folder in front of him. Finally, he opened it. "This document," he said, "represents the most recent last will and testament of Walter Harper." Most recent? Those two words caught my attention. I frowned without realizing it. Grant continued reading. The first few paragraphs were routine: personal belongings, small charitable donations, instructions regarding funeral expenses. Then he reached the section everyone had obviously been waiting for. "I hereby leave all remaining real property, financial assets, business interests, and associated holdings to my beloved daughter-in-law." He looked down at the page. "Margaret Harper." My mother slowly lowered her eyes. She didn't look surprised. My brother leaned back in his chair and quietly exhaled like someone whose biggest concern had just disappeared. Across the table, one of my uncles nodded to himself. Nobody looked at me. For a few seconds, I couldn't even process what I'd heard. Not because I expected everything to come to me. Honestly, I hadn't walked into that office assuming Grandpa had left me the orchard. But leaving everything to Mom? That didn't fit the man I knew. Grant kept reading. "Whose unwavering devotion and constant care have been a comfort during my final years." I looked up immediately. Constant care? My eyes moved from the paper to my mother. She kept staring at the table, then back to Grant. Maybe I'd misunderstood. Maybe there was another explanation. Still, that sentence echoed in my head. Grandpa didn't talk like that. Not because he wasn't kind, because he was practical. He didn't use phrases like unwavering devotion. He would have said, "She helped," or "She was there." Simple, direct, always. Grant continued reading more legal language, but I barely heard it. Instead, I found myself studying the document itself, the spacing, the margins, the way certain phrases were written. Occupational hazard, I guess. When you spend years reviewing financial records, your brain starts noticing patterns without permission. Something felt off. The meeting wrapped up with Grant explaining the next steps. "If there are no objections," he said, "the estate administration will proceed according to this document." Nobody spoke. I finally raised my hand slightly. "May I see the will?" Grant hesitated. Only for a second. Then he handed it across the table. I thanked him and started reading from the beginning myself. The wording bothered me even more the second time. It didn't sound like Grandpa. It sounded like someone trying to sound like a lawyer pretending to sound like Grandpa. I reached the final page. The signature was waiting at the bottom. Walter Harper. At first glance, it looked perfect. Almost too perfect. I stared at it longer than anyone else in the room seemed to think was necessary. I kept looking at the signature while everyone else started gathering their things. It wasn't that the signature looked fake. If anything, it looked unusually clean. Grandpa's handwriting had become less steady during his last year. I'd seen him sign insurance forms, equipment invoices, even birthday cards. His signature still looked like his, but it usually carried tiny signs of age. A slight hesitation, a shaky finish, something human. This one looked almost practiced. I looked up at Grant. "Can I ask a couple of questions?" "Of course." His smile stayed in place. "Who prepared this version of the will?" "I did." "And when was it signed?" He glanced at the document. 2 weeks before Mr. Harper passed away." I quietly repeated the timeline in my head. 2 weeks. That would have been during hospice. I nodded. "Did Grandpa request changes himself?" Grant folded his hands together. "Yes." "What changes did he specifically ask for?" His smile faded just a little. "The document speaks for itself." "I understand." I kept my voice calm. "I'm only asking because I spent quite a bit of time with him during those weeks." My brother sighed loudly. "Oh, come on, Emily. I'm asking a question. You're questioning Grandpa's wishes." "No." I looked at him. "I'm trying to understand them." Mom finally joined the conversation. "Grant doesn't owe anyone an interrogation." "I'm not interrogating him." Grant cleared his throat. "The estate process is already moving forward." "I know. So there's really no reason to revisit decisions Mr. Harper already made." "I haven't asked anyone to revisit them." There was a brief silence. I looked back down at the pages. One paragraph kept catching my attention. "Whose unwavering devotion and constant care." I couldn't let it go. "Can I ask one more thing?" Grant gave a short nod. "Go ahead." "Did Grandpa review the final wording himself?" "Naturally." "The reason I ask," I tapped the page gently, "is because this doesn't sound like him." Grant's expression hardened. People often express themselves differently in formal legal documents. "I agree. But legal language usually comes from the attorney." He didn't answer. "So that sentence, Emily." His voice interrupted mine before I finished. "I've been doing estate work for over 20 years. I know. I assure you this document was executed properly." "I didn't say it wasn't." His eyes stayed on mine for another second. Then he slowly gathered the papers back into his folder. It wasn't an aggressive movement. Just final. Like the conversation was over because he'd decided it was. Everyone around the table suddenly seemed uncomfortable. One of my cousins checked his phone. My uncle stood up and quietly walked toward the coffee station. Nobody wanted to be in the middle of it. Dad finally spoke for the first time that morning. "They're reasonable questions." The room went quiet. Mom turned toward him. "Frank." "What?" "She's only asking about the paperwork." Mom looked annoyed. "Grant has already answered." Dad didn't argue. He simply leaned back again and stayed silent. That small exchange told me more than I expected. He hadn't defended my opinion. He'd defended my right to ask. As the meeting wrapped up, Grant handed everyone a packet explaining the probate timeline. I accepted mine and thanked him. He gave a polite nod. Professional, controlled, but noticeably less friendly than when I'd arrived. Outside, people lingered in the parking lot for a few minutes before leaving. My brother unlocked his truck. "You always have to make everything difficult." I looked at him. I asked 3 questions. "You were looking for a fight?" "I wasn't." He shrugged. "Sounds the same to me." He climbed into his truck before I could respond. Mom barely said goodbye. She simply got into her car and followed him out of the parking lot. Dad was the last one left. He stood beside his car for a second. You okay? I think so. He nodded slowly. Then he surprised me. If something doesn't make sense? He paused, choosing his words carefully. Don't ignore that feeling. Before I could ask what he meant, he got into his car and drove away. I stayed in the parking lot with the probate packet still tucked under my arm. The timeline, the wording, the signature, Grant's reaction. None of those things proved anything on their own, but together, they no longer felt like coincidences. I didn't call Mom right away. I gave it 2 days. Part of me hoped the awkwardness from the will reading had simply been stress. People say things they don't mean after losing someone. Maybe that was all this was. By the 3rd afternoon, I convinced myself there was no harm in asking. She answered on the 4th ring. Hi, Mom. Emily. Her voice was polite, not warm. I was wondering if you had a copy of Grandpa's will. There was a short pause. Why? I'd like to read it again. You already saw it. I know. I just want to go through it carefully. Another pause. For what reason? I work with documents every day. I like understanding things before I move on. She let out a quiet sigh. Emily. I'm not trying to cause problems. I think you are. The words landed harder than I expected. I haven't challenged anything. You questioned Grant in front of everyone. I asked questions. You embarrassed him. I asked when the document was signed. You implied something wasn't legitimate. I never said that. She didn't respond immediately. When she finally spoke again, her tone had changed. You've always had a hard time accepting that things don't go your way. I actually looked around my office for a second, wondering if she'd confused me with someone else. Mom. What? I never expected Grandpa to leave everything to me. Really? Really? So why can't you let this go? Because I don't understand it. You don't have to. I'd just like a copy. No. The answer came instantly. So I can compare it with my notes. No. I'll even pay for the copies. I said no. I leaned back in my chair. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said something that surprised me even more. You need to stop obsessing over this inheritance. I frowned. I'm not obsessed with the inheritance. Then what are you obsessed with? The truth. She laughed. Not loudly. Just enough to let me know she didn't believe me. No, Emily. Her voice softened. I think you're hurt because your grandfather didn't choose you. I closed my eyes for a second. That wasn't it. Not even close. If Grandpa had chosen her honestly, I would have accepted it. I might have been disappointed. I might have needed time, but I would have accepted it. The problem wasn't the outcome. It was everything surrounding it. I miss Grandpa, I said quietly. So do I. I've been trying to understand his final decisions. You need to respect them. I do. Then stop digging. That word stuck with me. Digging. As though asking to read a legal document somehow crossed a line. I'll let you go, she said before I could answer. I have things to do. Okay. She didn't say goodbye. The call simply ended. I stared at my phone for a long moment before setting it face down on my desk. One of my coworkers walked past my office. You okay? Yeah. You don't sound convinced. I smiled a little. I'm thinking. About work? Sort of. She nodded and kept walking. The office slowly filled with the usual sounds again. Phones ringing, printers running, people discussing payroll deadlines, normal life. I opened the probate packet Grant had given us and read through it one more time. Nothing inside answered the questions that mattered. By the time I locked my office that evening, I'd made one decision. I wasn't going to argue with my mother anymore. If she didn't want to share the documents, I'd find another way to learn the truth. The first thing I did was stop asking people what they remembered. Memories are emotional. They're incomplete. Sometimes they're honest. Sometimes they're shaped by what people want to believe. Documents are different. I've spent my entire career as a CPA working with farm businesses around Maple Ridge. When clients tell me everything should balance, I don't take their word for it. I open the records. Money leaves footprints. Paperwork leaves timelines. Someone can forget a conversation. It's much harder to accidentally rewrite a paper trail. That mindset had saved more than one client over the years. Maybe it could help me now. I started with everything I legally had access to: the probate notices, county filing dates, property tax records, public ownership information. Nothing dramatic. Just ordinary records that anyone could request. I spread everything across the conference table in my office after everyone else had gone home. My assistant walked past and laughed. "Please tell me that's not another tax project." "I wish." She glanced at the folders. "You've been staying late a lot lately." "I know." "You should get some sleep." "I'll survive." She smiled. "If anyone can make paperwork exciting, it's you." "I'm not trying to make it exciting." "No? No. I'm trying to make it make sense." She wished me good night and headed home. The office became completely quiet. I started building a timeline. Grandpa entered hospice. The new will was supposedly signed. The probate process began. Boxes of records disappeared from the farmhouse. Every confirmed date went onto one sheet of paper. Every unanswered question went onto another. I wasn't looking for proof of fraud. Not yet. I was looking for inconsistencies. There was a difference. Around 9 that night, I poured myself another cup of coffee and looked back through my notes from the will reading. One sentence was circled twice. 2 weeks before Mr. Harper passed away. I remembered exactly where Grandpa had been during those 2 weeks. I had visited almost every day. I remembered medications, nurse schedules, physical therapy, quiet afternoons watching baseball. What I didn't remember was him mentioning a new will. That alone didn't prove anything. People are allowed to keep legal decisions private. Still, it bothered me. I opened my laptop again and searched my archived emails. Grandpa and I had exchanged dozens over the years, mostly boring things: equipment invoices, insurance renewals, questions about depreciation. One message caught my eye. It had been sent almost 3 years earlier. The subject line simply read, "Estate planning." I opened it. Grandpa had written only one sentence. "Rebecca explained everything clearly today. Glad we finally got it done." Rebecca. I leaned back in my chair. I knew exactly who that was. Rebecca Collins, an estate attorney in Maple Ridge. She'd handled several succession plans for local farming families, including, apparently, Grandpa's. I frowned. Grant had presented himself as though he'd handled everything, but Grandpa's own email suggested someone else had prepared estate documents years before. That wasn't unusual. People update wills all the time. Still, if Rebecca had drafted an earlier version, she might at least be able to answer a few procedural questions. Not about the contents. Attorney-client privilege wouldn't allow that. But maybe she could tell me how the process had originally been handled. Whether Grandpa had been careful, whether he usually kept copies, whether there were details I hadn't considered. None of that required anyone to break confidentiality. It simply required asking the right questions. I checked the time. Too late to call, so I opened my calendar instead. The earliest opening in my schedule was Thursday morning. I blocked off 2 hours. Then I searched for Rebecca Collins's office number and typed it into my phone before I could second-guess myself. I looked at the screen for another second. This wasn't about proving anyone guilty. It wasn't even about inheritance anymore. It was about finding out whether the story I'd been handed actually matched the facts. The next morning, just after her office opened, I took a slow breath and pressed the call button for Rebecca Collins. Rebecca Collins answered the phone herself. Rebecca speaking. My name is Emily Harper. There was a brief pause. Walter Harper's granddaughter? Yes. I was wondering if you might have a little time to talk. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked, Is this about the probate proceeding? It is. Another short silence. Can you come by this morning? I can. 10 o'clock. I'll be there. Her office sat in an old brick building just off the town square. It wasn't flashy. The waiting room had 2 armchairs, a bookshelf filled with legal guides, and framed photographs of local farms she'd helped keep in family ownership over the years. A receptionist greeted me with a smile. Ms. Collins will be right with you. I barely had time to sit before Rebecca appeared. She looked to be in her early 60s, dressed simply, carrying a legal pad instead of a stack of files. Emily. She shook my hand. I'm sorry about your grandfather. Thank you. He spoke about you often. That caught me off guard. He did? He was very proud of your accounting practice. I smiled without meaning to. He never really said that to my face. Rebecca smiled back. He didn't have to. She led me into her office and closed the door. I should explain something before we begin. I nodded. My obligation to Walter didn't end when he passed away. I understand. There are many things I legally cannot discuss. I'm not asking you to violate confidentiality. I'm glad. She folded her hands on the desk. So, tell me why you're here. I explained everything, the reading of the will, the language that felt unfamiliar, the questions Grant avoided, my mother's refusal to share copies. I tried to stick to facts instead of emotions. Rebecca listened without interrupting. When I finished, she stayed quiet for a moment. Then she asked one simple question. Do you believe your grandfather changed his mind? I thought about it. I believe people can change their minds. And Walter? I believe he would have told me. She nodded slowly. That's a fair answer. She opened a notebook and flipped through several pages. I first began working with Walter a little over 3 years ago. So you did prepare estate documents for him? I did. He emailed me once saying everything had finally been completed. I remember that meeting. I leaned forward slightly. Was he clear about what he wanted? Rebecca gave the careful kind of answer only an experienced attorney can give. Walter was never uncertain about his decisions. That sentence stayed with me. Never uncertain. He was also, she smiled faintly, remarkably organized. That sounds like him. He came to every meeting with notes. Of course he did. If he wanted something changed, he'd explain exactly why. I couldn't help asking. So, if someone wanted to revise an estate plan, they certainly could. And Walter understood that process? Very well. For the first time since walking in, I felt a little relief. At least I knew Grandpa hadn't signed documents he didn't understand. Rebecca noticed my expression. Don't feel too encouraged yet. The relief disappeared almost as quickly as it came. What do you mean? She looked down at the legal pad in front of her before meeting my eyes again. I've been following the probate filings. You have? Only what's publicly available. And? She chose her next words very carefully. Something about the timeline has been bothering me. I felt my stomach tighten. The timeline? She nodded. I wasn't contacted. I frowned. I'm sorry? If Walter had asked to make significant changes to the estate plan, she paused. I would have expected to hear from him. Maybe he decided to use someone else. That's possible. But she slowly closed the notebook in front of her. Emily, I'm afraid I have some bad news. I sat across from Rebecca without saying a word. She had just finished reviewing every note I'd brought with me. Copies of public filings, tax records, probate notices, my handwritten timeline. I'd spent days putting everything together because I needed someone who actually understood estate law to tell me whether I was imagining things. Rebecca slowly closed the folder. I wish I had better news. My stomach tightened. What happened? She folded her hands on top of the desk. The probate process has already moved much farther than I expected. I stared at her. What does that mean? It means the property isn't just tied up in paperwork anymore, it's already moving toward liquidation. For a second, I wasn't sure I understood. You mean, the orchard is scheduled for auction? The room suddenly felt much quieter. I looked down at the photographs I'd brought with me. Grandpa standing beside the oldest apple tree, the weathered barn, the little farmhouse porch where we'd eaten pie every harvest season. They're selling it? Rebecca nodded gently. If nothing interrupts the process? Yes. I leaned back in my chair. No one told me. I'm not surprised. She wasn't being sarcastic, just honest. Families fighting over estates often stopped communicating the moment money became involved. I let out a slow breath. Can we stop the sale? Rebecca didn't answer immediately, and that pause told me everything. It's possible, she finally said. Legally, yes. Hope flickered for about 2 seconds. Then she continued. But realistically? Not before the auction? She reached for another document and turned it toward me. The court recognizes the newer will until someone successfully challenges it. That challenge takes evidence, hearings, expert reviews, sometimes months. Months? Sometimes longer. I rubbed my forehead. The auction is in... She checked the notice. A little over 3 weeks. 3 weeks. That wasn't enough time to untangle forged documents, reopen probate, and convince a judge that everything had been handled improperly. So by the time the court figures it out, the orchard could already belong to someone else? Neither of us spoke. Outside her office window, people walked down the sidewalk carrying coffee cups like it was an ordinary Tuesday. Maybe it was. Just not for me. I promised Grandpa I'd take care of that place. Rebecca looked at me carefully. I believe you. My family doesn't even care about the orchard. They care about what it's worth. There was a difference. A huge one. I looked back at the auction notice. Developers had been buying farmland around Maple Ridge for years. Orchards disappeared almost overnight. Barns came down. New luxury homes went up. If one of them bought Grandpa's land, everything he'd spent his life building would disappear. I pictured the old trees being bulldozed, the irrigation lines ripped out, the farmhouse demolished because renovating it cost more than replacing it. I couldn't breathe for a second. There has to be something. Rebecca stayed quiet, letting me think instead of filling the silence. I appreciated that. Most people rushed to give advice. She waited. I finally asked the question neither of us wanted to answer. If someone buys it, and later the original will is proven real, what happens depends on several factors. But the property may not automatically come back. So Grandpa could still lose everything. She nodded once. Potentially. I laughed softly, but there wasn't anything funny about it. I spent years helping him keep that orchard alive. I know. And now I'm supposed to watch strangers buy it? Rebecca leaned forward slightly. No. I looked up. No? She studied me for a long moment. I said stopping the auction would be extremely difficult. You did. I didn't say you couldn't participate in it. I frowned. I'm not following. What if, she said carefully, the highest bidder was someone who actually wanted to preserve the orchard? I blinked. You mean? Rebecca held my gaze. There may be one other option. I didn't answer right away. Rebecca let the idea sit between us for a few seconds. You mean I buy my own grandfather's orchard? I finally asked. In simple terms, yes. I almost laughed. Rebecca, I don't have $400,000 sitting in a checking account. I know. And even if I somehow pulled that together, my family would recognize my name the second I registered for the auction. They would. So this doesn't solve anything. She reached for a legal pad and drew a small diagram. It doesn't work if you are the bidder. She wrote one phrase in the middle. Limited liability company. You've worked with business entities your entire career, she said. You already understand how they operate. I've created them for clients. What if you created one for yourself? I stared at the paper. The company becomes the bidder. She nodded. The public record would show the company's name, not yours. I slowly leaned forward, so no one at the auction would immediately know who owns the company. Exactly. I looked back at the words she'd written. A business entity, an anonymous bidder. It sounded surprisingly simple, maybe too simple. There has to be a catch. There are several. She smiled faintly. The biggest one is money. That part I already knew. She opened another folder and began writing numbers. The company would still need enough funds to compete with developers, local investors, and neighboring farms. I could lose. You absolutely could. And if someone outbids me, the orchard is gone. Neither of us tried to soften that reality. I appreciated that. False hope never helped anyone. I crossed my arms and thought through every account I owned, my firm's operating reserve, my personal savings, investment accounts, certificates of deposit. Even if I emptied nearly everything, I still wasn't sure it would be enough. Rebecca seemed to notice the math happening in my head. What are you thinking? I've spent years building my accounting firm. You have. If I pour everything into one auction, you could be taking a tremendous financial risk. I nodded. My employees depend on me. They do. I can't gamble with payroll. Rebecca didn't interrupt. She understood that this wasn't just about land anymore. People trusted me with their jobs, their mortgages, their families. Making one emotional decision couldn't destroy everything else I'd built. She finally said, I'm not asking you to make this decision today. I know. I'm asking you to decide what losing the orchard would cost you. That question stayed with me. Not how much the property was worth, what it would cost to let it go. Those weren't the same thing. I drove back to my office without turning on the radio. For the rest of the afternoon, I reviewed tax returns for clients, answered emails, and signed financial reports. From the outside, it looked like an ordinary workday. Inside my head, I kept hearing Grandpa's voice. Trees remember who took care of them. By evening, everyone had gone home. The office became quiet. I locked my door, opened my laptop, and created a private spreadsheet. Not for a client, for myself. One column listed every liquid asset I owned. Another listed investments I could sell. A third estimated what I could realistically borrow without putting my firm in danger. The totals changed every time I adjusted a number. I erased figures, added others, started over. Twice I almost closed the file. Twice I opened it again. This wasn't about becoming wealthy. If anything, I was preparing to become much less comfortable financially. But every version of the spreadsheet led me back to the same question. If I walked away now, would I regret protecting my savings more than protecting Grandpa's life's work? I leaned back in my chair, looked at the final total on the screen, and quietly picked up my calculator one more time. For the first time, I wasn't calculating whether I wanted to try. I was calculating whether I had just enough to make it possible. The spreadsheet stayed open on my computer until nearly midnight. I looked at the numbers one last time before calling Rebecca. I've made my decision. She didn't sound surprised. I thought you might. I want to move forward. Then don't waste any more time. By the next morning, we were already talking through the legal steps. The first thing we need is a separate entity, Rebecca explained. If you're serious about protecting your identity, the bidder can't be Emily Harper. I've helped clients set up companies for years. Now you're the client. That felt strange. Normally, I was the one reviewing paperwork for someone else's business. Now I was signing documents that could determine the future of my grandfather's orchard. We settled on a simple name: Maple Ridge Orchard Holdings, LLC. It wasn't flashy. That was the point. Rebecca smiled when she saw my expression. You don't like it. I don't hate it. You wanted something more personal. I did. But personal names attract attention, she said. A generic holding company doesn't. She was right. The less interesting the company looked, the better. Within the next couple of days, I filed the paperwork, opened a business bank account, and completed every form the auction required. Every signature made everything feel more real. There was no turning back anymore. At my accounting firm, life continued as usual. Clients called with payroll questions. Farm owners stopped by to review quarterly taxes. Employees asked for approval on routine reports. No one knew that during my lunch breaks I was meeting with bankers instead of eating. One afternoon, I sat across from a commercial loan officer who flipped through my financial statements. You have a healthy business, he said. I've worked hard for it. I can see that. He tapped the folder thoughtfully. You understand we're talking about a significant amount of money. I do. And this purchase isn't for expanding your accounting firm. No. It's an investment property? I hesitated. Technically, yes. Emotionally, not even close. You could call it that. He nodded and continued reading. The meeting lasted nearly an hour. He asked about revenue, cash flow, outstanding debt, future projections. Normally, I loved conversations like this. Numbers were predictable. This time, every answer felt personal. When the meeting ended, he stood and shook my hand. We'll review everything and let you know. How long? A few business days. A few days. That sounded short. It felt endless. I walked back to my office, trying not to overthink it. Rebecca called before I even made it inside. How did it go? I think... Okay. You don't sound convinced. I'm not. She laughed softly. Neither are bankers. Fair point. For the next several days, I tried to focus on work. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart jumped. Most of the time, it wasn't the bank. It was a client, or my assistant, or a reminder about a meeting. At home, I started quietly preparing for the possibility that the loan would be approved. I reviewed my personal savings again. Investment accounts, emergency funds, retirement investments I had promised myself never to touch before 60. I wrote every number on a yellow legal pad. If this happened, almost everything I'd built over the past decade would be tied to one auction, one piece of land, one chance. I looked around my apartment that evening. Nothing about my life looked extravagant. I drove the same SUV I'd owned for years. I rarely took vacations. Most of what I'd earned had gone back into growing my business. Now I was getting ready to risk nearly all of it. Not because the orchard would make me rich, because I couldn't stand the thought of watching someone erase everything Grandpa had spent his life protecting. 3 days later, my phone rang while I was reviewing a client's tax return. The caller ID showed the bank. I answered immediately. The loan officer sounded professional, but impossible to read. Ms. Harper, we've completed our review. I tightened my grip on the phone. There is one final step before we can give you our decision. I barely slept after the call from the bank. They hadn't rejected the loan, but they hadn't approved it either. Everything still depended on paperwork that seemed to multiply every time I completed another form. While I was waiting, Rebecca called and asked if I could stop by her office. I found something, she said. That was enough to get me in my car. She already had several folders spread across the conference table when I arrived. "This isn't about the loan," she said. "It's about your grandfather." I sat down without taking my coat off. Rebecca opened a thick file and carefully removed a document that looked much older than the others. I recognized the formatting immediately. "What is it?" "The estate plan I drafted for Walter several years ago." I looked at the pages but didn't touch them. "You still had a copy?" "I keep records of completed work. Not the originals, but enough to verify what was prepared." She turned the document toward me. My eyes stopped on one paragraph. I read it once. Then again. I couldn't speak. Rebecca quietly finished the sentence for me. "Yes, the orchard was intended to pass to you." I let out a slow breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, so I wasn't imagining any of it. No. He really wanted me to have it. He did. For a moment, neither of us talked. It wasn't excitement I felt. It was relief. Not because I wanted the land for myself, because it confirmed something much more important. Grandpa hadn't changed his mind. Someone else had changed the story. Rebecca slid another note across the table. "There's something else." I looked up. "You mentioned the brass key Walter gave you." I nodded. "I still have it." "Have you used it?" "No." "You should." I frowned. "He told me to wait." "And what exactly did he say?" I closed my eyes for a second, hearing Grandpa's tired voice as clearly as if he were sitting beside me. "When they're finished talking, open the cedar box." Rebecca smiled slightly. I think he chose those words very carefully. I drove straight to the orchard after leaving her office. The house felt different without Grandpa there. Too quiet. I unlocked the front door and stood in the hallway for a moment. Everything looked exactly as he'd left it. His old coat still hung beside the back entrance. His reading glasses rested on the small table next to his favorite chair. I walked upstairs to the cedar chest he had owned for decades. I'd seen it my entire life. As a kid, I thought it held old blankets. I never questioned it. Now I carefully lifted the lid. Inside were a few neatly folded keepsakes, old photographs, a military medal, several handwritten recipe cards from Grandma. Beneath them sat a small envelope, and beside it, a second key. This one was attached to a metal tag from the local bank. Safe deposit box. I picked it up slowly. So, that's what this is. Underneath the key was another envelope. My name was written across the front in Grandpa's familiar handwriting. Just seeing it made my throat tighten. I carefully opened the seal. The letter wasn't long. It didn't explain everything. It didn't accuse anyone. It contained only one message. "Let the document speak before you do." I read it again, and then a third time. Grandpa knew. Maybe not every detail, but he knew enough to leave me a path instead of instructions. He wasn't asking me to argue. He wasn't asking me to fight with the family. He was asking me to trust the truth. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. For the first time since the funeral, I stopped feeling like I had to rush. The temptation to confront my mother, to demand answers, to expose every inconsistency immediately. It was still there. But Grandpa had already made his choice. He wanted facts to come first, not emotions. I slipped both keys into my pocket, closed the cedar chest, and quietly locked it again. As I walked back toward the front door, I looked at the envelope in my hand one more time. Whatever was waiting inside that safe deposit box, Grandpa had trusted me to find it only when I was ready to let the evidence speak louder than I ever could. The letter stayed in my purse, not because I planned to show it to anyone, because every time I started second-guessing myself, I took it out and read those 11 words again. "Let the document speak before you do." That became my rule. I stopped arguing with my family. I stopped trying to convince anyone that something was wrong. Instead, I focused on what I could actually control: The financing, the company, the auction. A couple of days later, the bank finally called me back. "We're prepared to move forward," the loan officer said, "assuming you're comfortable with the terms." He slid the paperwork across the desk. The monthly payment made my stomach tighten. The collateral section tightened it even more. I looked up. "So if this investment fails, you understand the risks?" "I do. If the company defaults, these assets are exposed." I nodded slowly. My savings, my investment accounts, a large portion of what I'd spent years building. Nothing about this was small. The loan officer gave me a few minutes alone to read everything. I wasn't looking for hidden clauses. I understood every paragraph. That almost made it worse. Ignorance would have been easier. Instead, I knew exactly what I was risking. When he returned, he asked a simple question. "Would you like more time?" I looked down at the signature line. Then I thought about Grandpa standing in the orchard, pruning trees long after everyone else had gone home. He never quit halfway through something that mattered. Neither would I. I signed. Walking out of the bank, I didn't feel victorious. I felt responsible. There was no safety net anymore. Every dollar had a purpose. Over the next week, I transferred funds into the company's account. Personal savings, business profits I'd legally set aside, investment proceeds after selling part of my portfolio. Watching those balances shrink wasn't easy. Years of careful planning disappeared from my personal accounts in a matter of days. I kept reminding myself this wasn't reckless spending. It was a calculated decision. Still, there were moments when I wondered if I was making the biggest mistake of my life. Work helped keep my mind occupied. My clients had no idea what was happening outside the office. They asked about tax deadlines, equipment depreciation, farm operating expenses. I answered every question the same way I always had: professional, calm. No one could tell my own financial future depended on an auction that was getting closer every day. My family, meanwhile, seemed to be living in a completely different reality. One Saturday morning, I drove past the local dealership on my way to meet a client. A bright red pickup caught my eye. Standing beside it was my brother. He was grinning from ear to ear while a salesman handed him the keys. I almost kept driving. Instead, I pulled into the parking lot. "New truck?" I asked. He turned around, surprised to see me. "Emily." He patted the hood proudly. "What do you think?" "It's nice." "It should be." He laughed. "I've always wanted one like this." I looked at the temporary tag in the window. This wasn't cheap. He shrugged like it wasn't a big deal. "Sometimes you have to enjoy life." "Already?" He frowned. "What do you mean?" I thought the estate was still being finalized. He waved his hand dismissively. "Mom said the money's basically ours." Basically. That word stayed with me. The paperwork wasn't finished. The legal questions weren't resolved. The property hadn't even gone to auction yet. But my brother was already spending money he didn't officially have. He noticed me looking at the truck. "You should treat yourself once in a while." I smiled politely. "Maybe." He climbed into the driver's seat. "You'll see. Everything's finally working out." I stepped back as he drove away, still smiling. He looked completely convinced the future belonged to him. I stood there for another moment before getting back into my own SUV, not because I envied the truck, because it reminded me how differently we saw Grandpa's legacy. To my brother, the orchard had already become cash. To me, it was still home. A few days later, Rebecca called. Her voice was calm, but there was a hint of urgency. "The auction schedule has been confirmed." I closed the file I was working on. "What day?" She told me the date. It was less than a week away. Everything we'd been preparing for over the past several weeks had finally become real. I looked at the calendar on my desk, quietly crossed off another day, and realized there were no more delays left between me and the auction. I couldn't make myself walk into the auction room. Rebecca had offered, more than once. "You don't have to sit through it," she said as she parked beside the county administration building. "I'll handle the bidding." "I know. You trust me." "I do." That wasn't the problem. The problem was knowing that inside that room, people were calmly putting prices on the place where Walter had spent almost his entire life. The orchard wasn't just land to me. It was the smell of fresh apples in September. It was the old ladder Walter refused to replace because he insisted it had good luck built into it. It was Saturday mornings balancing invoices at the kitchen table while he argued with the radio. Hearing someone describe it as Parcel 18A felt wrong. Rebecca reached for the door handle before looking back at me. "If anything changes, I'll text." I nodded. "And Emily?" "Yeah? No matter what happens today, you already did everything you could." I managed a small smile. "I hope that's enough." She disappeared inside, carrying nothing but a leather portfolio and years of courtroom confidence. I stayed in my car. Rain tapped softly against the windshield. The parking lot slowly filled with trucks, SUVs, and luxury sedans. Some people walked inside wearing expensive boots and business jackets. Others looked like local farmers who had simply come to see how much the orchard would sell for. None of them knew what Walter had meant to me. To them, it was an investment. To me, it still felt like home. My phone buzzed. "Rebecca. Auction has started." That was all. No details. I looked at the dashboard clock. Every minute suddenly felt much longer than it actually was. I tried distracting myself by opening my laptop. There were still client emails waiting, quarterly tax estimates, payroll corrections. Questions I normally answered within minutes. I read the same email 3 times without understanding a single sentence. Another vibration. "Rebecca. Opening bid accepted." I swallowed. No number. Just enough information to let me know things were moving. A few minutes later, another message arrived. "Rebecca. Competition is stronger than expected." I stared at the screen. Stronger than expected. Those 3 words tightened every muscle in my shoulders. I called her, straight to voicemail. Of course, phones weren't allowed during active bidding. I leaned back and closed my eyes. Walter's last letter came back to me. "Don't rush because you're afraid. People who panic usually make expensive mistakes." Easy advice to remember. Much harder to live by. A pickup truck pulled into the space beside me. 2 men climbed out talking loudly. "Developer from the city's here. I heard they want the orchard for luxury homes." "Wouldn't surprise me. If they get it, those trees are gone by winter." They walked away before noticing me. I watched them disappear into the building. Luxury homes. The words made my stomach turn. Walter had spent decades protecting that land. The idea of bulldozers replacing the apple trees felt almost unbearable. Another text. "Rebecca. Still in." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Still in. That meant Maple Ridge Orchard Holdings was still bidding. Still alive. I looked across the road toward the hills. Even from here, I could see the tops of the orchard trees in the distance. Walter used to joke that you could always tell the seasons by looking at those rows. Spring was hope. Summer was hard work. Fall was gratitude. Winter was patience. Maybe that was why he loved the place so much. Every season asked something different from you. Another vibration. This one came from my brother. "Grant. Auction almost over. Mom's already talking about vacation plans." I stared at the message. Vacation plans. He really believed everything had already been won. I locked my phone without replying. A few minutes later, Rebecca finally called. I answered before the first ring finished. "Rebecca." Her voice was calm, but quieter than usual. "We're still bidding." "How bad?" "Worse than I hoped." Silence hung between us for a second. "I need you to stay calm." "I am." No, you're trying to be. She knew me too well. The developer hasn't backed down, she continued. Neither have we. So there are still 3 bidders? Not anymore. I gripped the steering wheel. How many? She paused just long enough to make my heart race. It's down to 2. The line went quiet again before she added softly, and the next number might decide everything. My phone stayed silent for what felt like forever. I kept staring at the screen, almost afraid to blink. Cars came and went from the parking lot. People walked into the building with coffee cups, laughing about completely ordinary things, while my entire future felt like it was balanced inside one conference room. Then my phone rang. Rebecca. I answered so quickly I nearly dropped it. Hello? For a second, all I heard was noise in the background, chairs moving, people talking, someone announcing paperwork instructions. Then Rebecca finally spoke. It's over. I couldn't read her voice. My heart sank. Okay. There was another pause. Then she laughed softly. Emily. What? We got it. Everything around me seemed to stop. What? We won. I closed my eyes. I don't. We're the successful bidder. I couldn't find a single word. For months I'd prepared myself for losing. I'd imagined driving past the orchard knowing someone else owned it. I'd imagined bulldozers replacing the apple trees. I'd imagined explaining to myself that at least I'd tried. I had never really pictured this moment. Rebecca kept talking. The developer backed out after the last increase. Really? They decided it wasn't worth paying more. I covered my mouth with one hand. So Maple Ridge Orchard Holdings is now the legal purchaser, pending final closing. I laughed once. Not because anything was funny, because my body suddenly didn't know what else to do. I can't believe it. I can. Rebecca sounded genuinely happy. You took an enormous risk. I almost talked myself out of it. I know. And now? You own Walter's orchard. I looked toward the hills again. The trees were still there. Exactly where they'd always been. The difference was something no one else could see. They weren't disappearing anymore. I'll meet you inside, Rebecca said. There are a few documents you'll need to sign. I'll be there. And Emily. Yeah? Remember our agreement? I smiled. I won't say a word. Good. She ended the call. I stayed in the driver's seat for another minute before stepping outside. The air smelled like rain and fresh-cut grass. For the first time since Walter died, I felt like I could actually breathe. Inside the building, Rebecca spread several documents across a conference table. These transfer the purchase to Maple Ridge Orchard Holdings. I signed each page carefully. No dramatic speeches, no celebration, just signatures, page after page. When I finished, Rebecca slid the folder closed. Congratulations, I smiled. Thank you. You officially own the orchard. It still doesn't feel real? It will. She handed me another envelope. This contains the preliminary ownership paperwork. I looked at the company name printed across the top. Maple Ridge Orchard Holdings, LLC. Nothing connected it to me personally, exactly as planned. If anyone searches today's records, I asked, what will they see? The company. And my name? Not unless they know where to look. I nodded. That mattered. Not because I wanted to hide forever, because I wasn't ready for my family to know. Not yet. Rebecca gathered the rest of the paperwork. So, what's your first decision as owner? I thought for a moment. Nothing. She looked surprised. Nothing? I don't want to change anything. A small smile crossed her face. Walter would have liked that answer. On the drive home, my phone buzzed again. This time it was my brother. A family group chat had suddenly become very active. Grant had already sent 3 pictures from a steakhouse. One showed him raising a glass. Another showed my mother smiling wider than I'd seen in months. The caption read, Finally sold. Time to celebrate. A few seconds later, another message appeared. Mom, your grandfather would have wanted us to enjoy this blessing. Then another. Grant, vacation next month. Everybody deserves it after all this stress. I stared at the screen. Neither of them knew who had bought the orchard. Neither of them realized they were celebrating because someone else had just taken ownership of the property they thought was gone forever. I typed a reply, then deleted it. There was no reason to interrupt their celebration. Not yet. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, started the engine, and quietly drove toward the orchard that finally belonged to me. The closing process took another couple of weeks. There were inspections, signatures, wire transfers, and more paperwork than I thought was possible. Since Maple Ridge Orchard Holdings was the buyer, everything moved through the company instead of through my personal accounts. That was exactly how Rebecca had planned it. The cleaner the paper trail, she reminded me, the fewer questions you'll have to answer. I appreciated that more every day. My life outside the orchard stayed almost the same. I went to my accounting office every morning, met with clients, answered emails, and pretended nothing unusual had happened. Nobody there knew I'd just taken on the biggest financial risk of my life. I preferred it that way. One afternoon, my phone buzzed while I was reviewing a client's tax return. It was another message in the family group chat. Grant had posted a picture of his brand new pickup truck. Bright red, still wearing temporary plates. Finally treated myself, he wrote. A few relatives immediately replied with congratulations. Looks amazing. You deserve it. What a beautiful truck. A few minutes later, my mother shared pictures from a furniture showroom. She was comparing leather sectionals and dining tables that easily cost more than my first car. Thinking about renovating, she wrote. Grant replied almost instantly. Go for it. Life's short. I looked at the screen for a long moment. Neither of them had mentioned Walter. Not once. The orchard had been sold. The money had arrived. As far as they were concerned, that chapter was finished. I set my phone down and went back to work. Not because their messages didn't bother me, because there wasn't any point arguing with people who believed everything had gone exactly as planned. That evening, I stopped by the orchard. The caretaker met me near the equipment shed. So, he said with a friendly smile, have you met the new owner yet? I almost laughed. Not officially. They keeping the orchard running? That's the plan. He nodded with obvious relief. Good. I was worried we'd all lose our jobs. I don't think that's going to happen. You know something? Just a feeling. He smiled. I hope you're right. As I walked through the rows of trees, I realized something. Walter hadn't just left behind land. He'd left behind people. Workers. Families. Seasonal employees who counted on harvest season every year. Saving the orchard had quietly protected all of them too. That thought stayed with me all the way home. When I got back to my apartment, I unlocked the small fireproof cabinet inside my office. The official deed was inside a thick envelope. I pulled it out carefully. Owner, Maple Ridge Orchard Holdings, LLC. Every signature was complete. Every page had been recorded. It was real. I ran my hand across the folder for a second before placing it inside the bottom drawer of my desk. Then I locked it. Nobody would accidentally find it there. Not clients. Not friends. Especially not my family. The key went onto my own keyring beside the small brass key Walter had given me. Somehow, seeing them together felt right. Over the next few weeks, family conversations became strangely cheerful. Mom talked about remodeling her kitchen. Grant started discussing weekend fishing trips with his new truck. And Aunt mentioned that everyone seemed less stressed now that the estate was settled. I mostly listened. Whenever someone asked what I'd been doing lately, I gave ordinary answers. Work's been busy. I've had a lot of clients. Nothing exciting. None of it was technically a lie. The funniest part was that my family occasionally complained about the anonymous company that had bought the orchard. "I wonder what they're planning," Grant said during one phone call. "Probably another corporation," Mom replied. "They'll never love that place the way Dad did." I stayed quiet. If only they knew. One Friday afternoon, just before closing my office for the weekend, another envelope arrived in my mailbox. I recognized my mother's handwriting immediately. Inside was a cream-colored invitation with tiny autumn leaves printed around the edges. "Thanksgiving dinner. Our house family gathering. 6 p.m. At the bottom, my mother had written a short note by hand. "I hope you'll come this year. We have a lot to celebrate." I read that last sentence twice. A lot to celebrate. I slipped the invitation back into the envelope, already knowing I was going. Not because I wanted turkey, not because I wanted another awkward family dinner. Because for the first time in months, I had a feeling that Thanksgiving was going to be very different from what everyone at that table expected. The Thanksgiving invitation sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days. Every time I walked past it, I asked myself the same question. Do I really need to go? Life had finally become quiet again. The orchard was safe. The employees had stayed. My accounting firm was busy. For the first time in nearly a year, I was sleeping through the night. Part of me wondered if exposing everything would only reopen wounds that had finally started to heal. One evening, I called Rebecca. "So," she said as soon as she answered, "you're thinking about canceling. Was it that obvious?" "I've known you long enough." I laughed quietly. "I just don't know what the point is anymore." "The orchard is yours." "Exactly. They don't know that." "I know. So what's bothering you?" I looked out my apartment window for a moment before answering. "I don't want revenge." Rebecca didn't respond right away. Finally, she said, "Good." I frowned. "Good? If revenge were your goal, I'd tell you not to go. And if it isn't? Then why are you going?" That question stayed with me even after we hung up. Why was I going? Not to embarrass my mother, not to humiliate Grant, not to prove I was smarter. Those answers were easy. The real answer took longer. I wanted the truth to exist in the same room as the people who had spent months rewriting it. Nothing more. Nothing less. The following afternoon, I unlocked the drawer in my office. Inside were several folders. I pulled out 3 of them and placed them on my desk. The first contained the certified purchase documents for Maple Ridge Orchard Holdings. The second held copies Rebecca had obtained of Walter's earlier estate planning records. The third contained records from the bank and county offices showing the legal transfer of ownership. I spread them across the desk. Not because I needed to study them again, because I wanted to make sure I wasn't acting out of emotion. I checked every page, every signature, every date. Everything matched. Facts had a strange kind of comfort. They didn't change depending on who was telling the story. As I organized the papers, something slipped from inside one of the folders. A folded piece of stationery. Walter's handwriting. I had read the letter before, but not in several weeks. I unfolded it carefully. Most of it was personal. He thanked me for standing beside him when he needed someone. He apologized for knowing the family might make things difficult after he was gone. Near the bottom, one sentence had been underlined. "Let the documents speak when people refuse to hear you." I smiled before I even realized I was smiling. That sounded exactly like Walter. Simple, practical. No drama, no speeches, just evidence. I folded the letter again and slipped it back into its protective sleeve. For the first time since receiving the invitation, I stopped wondering whether I should attend. The only question left was how. Thanksgiving morning arrived faster than I expected. I made coffee, answered a few client emails, and even finished reviewing a quarterly financial statement. Keeping my normal routine helped settle my nerves. Around noon, my phone buzzed. Grant had posted another message in the family group chat. "Can't wait for tonight. Someone replied with turkey emojis. Another aunt joked that Mom had been cooking for 2 days. Everything looked perfectly ordinary, almost enough to make me forget how that dinner would eventually unfold. I opened my closet and chose a simple dark green sweater with black slacks. Nothing flashy. Nothing that looked like I was trying to make a statement. Before leaving, I placed the 3 document folders inside my old leather portfolio, the same one I'd carried to client meetings for years. It didn't look special. That was exactly why I liked it. I closed the clasps and picked it up. For a brief second, I considered putting it back down. I could still drive somewhere else. I could spend Thanksgiving alone. I could protect the peace I'd finally rebuilt. My hand stayed on the handle. Then I remembered Walter's note one more time. Let the document speak. I took a slow breath, picked up my car keys, tucked the leather portfolio under my arm, locked my apartment door, and headed to my mother's house. By the time I pulled into my mother's driveway, most of the family had already arrived. Cars lined both sides of the street. Through the front window, I could see people laughing, carrying serving dishes, and greeting each other with hugs. From the outside, it looked like every Thanksgiving we'd ever had. I picked up my leather portfolio from the passenger seat. For a second, I almost left it in the car. Instead, I carried it inside. My mother opened the door before I could knock. There you are, she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I was beginning to think you weren't coming. I said I would. She glanced at the portfolio. Working on Thanksgiving? I smiled politely. Just stopped by the office earlier. She accepted the answer without asking anything else. The portfolio stayed in my hand. No one seemed to think much about it. Inside, the house smelled like roasted turkey, cinnamon, and fresh bread. My aunts were setting the table. The younger cousins were arguing over football. Someone had old holiday music playing in the background. For a few minutes, everything felt normal. Grant walked over carrying a drink. Emily. Grant. He looked unusually cheerful. You've been busy lately. Always. You should take a vacation. I almost laughed. I'll think about it. You know, he continued, sometimes you have to enjoy life. He said it casually, but I couldn't help noticing the expensive watch on his wrist. I'd never seen him wear one before. Nice watch. He grinned. Thanks. New? Yeah. He lifted his arm proudly. Figured I'd treat myself. I'm happy you like it. He smiled again, but there was something restless underneath it. His eyes kept drifting toward our mother, almost like he was checking whether she approved of everything he said. The conversation ended when another relative called him into the kitchen. I wandered toward the hallway to hang up my coat. As I reached the corner, I heard voices coming from the pantry. Mom's voice. Low. Serious. Just stick to what we've been saying, Grant answered quietly. I know. No extra details. I said I know. If Emily asks questions again, she won't. How can you be sure? A long pause. Then Grant sighed. Because she gave up months ago. I stayed completely still. Neither of them knew I was only a few feet away. Mom spoke again. We don't need people getting confused now. I'm not going to say anything. Good. Their footsteps moved closer. I slipped into the dining room just before they walked out. A few seconds later, they joined everyone else, smiling as though nothing had happened. I didn't confront them. Not yet. Dinner was still being prepared. The house buzzed with conversations about football, recipes, Christmas shopping, and travel plans. Only I knew another conversation had just happened behind a closed door. A little later, I stepped onto the back porch to get some fresh air. The cold November breeze felt good. A moment later, the sliding door opened again. My father walked outside carrying 2 mugs of coffee. You mind? Not at all. He handed me one. We stood quietly for a while, watching the last of the autumn leaves blow across the yard. Finally, he spoke. "You've seemed different." "In what way?" "Quieter." I shrugged. "A lot has happened." He nodded. "Yeah." Another silence. Unlike the awkward ones inside, this one wasn't uncomfortable, just heavy. He stared into his coffee. "I've been thinking about your grandfather." "So have I." "He trusted people too easily." I looked at him. "What makes you say that?" He rubbed the side of his neck before answering. "There were a lot of papers toward the end." "What kind of papers?" "I honestly don't know." He gave a tired smile. "Your mother asked me to sign something one afternoon." I felt my heartbeat slow. "You signed it?" "I did." "Did you read it first?" He looked embarrassed. "No." "Why not?" "I thought it was routine estate paperwork." He shook his head. "I should have looked." "You never found out what it was?" "No." He stared out across the backyard. "I keep wondering whether I made a mistake." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Inside, someone laughed loudly. Plates began clattering onto the dining room table. Dinner was almost ready. Dad took a slow sip of his coffee before quietly saying, "If there's something I don't know, Emily." He stopped himself. Then he looked directly at me for the first time that evening. "I hope it's not too late to make it right." The voices inside grew louder as everyone started taking their seats. I glanced at the leather portfolio resting beside the back door. For the first time all day, I wasn't wondering whether I should open it. I was realizing the moment Walter had prepared me for was only minutes away. I showed up a little earlier than everyone else, carrying a plain brown leather folder tucked under my arm. It wasn't flashy. Honestly, it looked like the kind of folder any accountant would bring to finish paperwork before a holiday weekend. No one paid attention to it. Mom was already in the kitchen directing everyone like nothing unusual had happened over the past few months. The smell of roasted turkey filled the house, mixed with cinnamon and baked apples. For a second, it almost felt like every Thanksgiving we'd ever had. Almost. "Emily," Mom said without looking at me, "there are extra plates in the cabinet." "Sure." That was it. No hug, no question about work, no mention of Walter. Just another task. I quietly set the table while my father arranged chairs in the dining room. He looked older than I remembered. Every few minutes he glanced toward me, like he wanted to say something, but each time he stopped himself. Grant pulled into the driveway with his brand new pickup truck. He climbed out wearing an expensive jacket I'd never seen before. He looked pleased with himself. "Nice truck," Dad said. Grant grinned. "Figured it was time for an upgrade." Mom laughed. "You deserve it." I looked out the window at the truck for a second. I knew exactly where that confidence came from. As far as Grant was concerned, the inheritance was settled. The orchard was gone, the money had been distributed, and the whole chapter was over. He had no reason to think otherwise. Rebecca had been right. Sometimes people started spending money long before they truly owned it. Lunch started quietly. People talked about football, weather, gas prices, neighbors, and holiday travel. My cousins joked with each other while the kids ran through the hallway chasing one another with paper napkins. On the surface, everything looked perfectly normal. Underneath it, every conversation felt carefully controlled. Whenever Walter's name came up, someone changed the subject within seconds. Dad barely spoke. Grant filled every silence. Mom smiled constantly. Too constantly. I noticed she kept watching everyone's reactions, almost like she wanted to make sure the room stayed exactly as she planned. At one point, Grant leaned toward me. "So, how's business?" "Busy." "Still doing accounting?" "I am." He nodded. "That's good." There wasn't much warmth in the conversation. It felt more like small talk between coworkers than siblings. I simply smiled and took another sip of water. If you're still with me, let me know in the comments whether you've ever been to a family gathering where everyone acted polite while pretending nothing was wrong. Dessert came out, and the mood relaxed even more. Someone started sharing old childhood stories. People laughed. Even I laughed once or twice. It almost made me question everything I'd been preparing for. The leather folder rested beside my chair. I hadn't touched it once. For a brief moment, I wondered if Walter had been right about waiting. Maybe this wasn't the day. Maybe letting everything go would finally bring peace. Then I caught Mom and Grant exchanging a quick look across the table. It lasted only a second. They thought nobody noticed. I did. Grant gave the smallest nod. Mom smiled back. That quiet little exchange erased every doubt I'd been carrying. A few minutes later, coffee was poured around the table. The conversation slowed. People settled back into their chairs. Mom gently placed her cup onto the table and folded her hands together. "I've been thinking," she said. The room became noticeably quieter. "Since we're all together." Grant leaned back, already smiling. "I think Walter would have wanted us to remember how generous he was." Several relatives nodded. Mom continued. "The inheritance process wasn't easy, but everything worked out the way it was supposed to." She looked directly at me. "I know some people had questions in the beginning." The room suddenly felt much smaller. "But thankfully," she continued with a calm smile, "we were able to honor Walter's final wishes." Nobody noticed the leather folder resting beside my chair. Not yet. I slowly placed one hand on top of it as Mom prepared to say even more about the inheritance in front of everyone. Mom smiled as she looked around the table. "I think Walter would be happy knowing everything ended fairly." A few relatives nodded. Grant lifted his coffee mug like the conversation was already over. I finally spoke. "I don't think that's true." Every head turned toward me. Mom's smile faded just a little. "What do you mean?" I reached beside my chair and picked up the brown leather folder. "I wasn't planning to interrupt Thanksgiving," I said calmly. "But since we're talking about Walter's wishes, everyone deserves to hear the whole story." Grant let out a quiet laugh. "Oh, Emily, seriously?" "Just let her finish," Dad said softly. The room fell silent. I opened the folder and removed the first document. "This is the recorded deed from the county." I slid several copies across the dining table. People leaned forward. Grant frowned as he picked one up. Mom adjusted her glasses. "The buyer listed here is Maple Ridge Orchard Holdings, LLC." She looked back at me. "So?" I held her gaze. "I own Maple Ridge Orchard Holdings." Nobody spoke. For several seconds, the only sound in the room was the ticking clock in the hallway. Grant blinked. "What?" "I formed the company before the auction." "You... what?" "I bought Walter's orchard." Grant laughed again, but this time it sounded forced. "That's impossible." "It isn't." I calmly pointed to the ownership records attached behind the deed. "My name is listed as the managing member." Grant flipped through the pages faster. Mom grabbed another copy. Her hands had started shaking. "You bought it?" "Yes." Dad slowly leaned back in his chair. His eyes never left the papers. I continued before anyone could interrupt. "So when the orchard was auctioned," I paused for just a second. "The family unknowingly sold it to Walter's intended heir." The room went completely still. Grant's face lost its color. Mom stared at me as if she couldn't process the words. I reached into the folder again. "There are 2 more documents." I carefully placed an older will on the table. Rebecca's signature appeared near the bottom alongside the witnesses. "This is the estate plan Rebecca Collins prepared years ago." I looked around the room. Walter left the orchard to me. Dad picked it up first. His eyes moved slowly across every page. "I remember this," he whispered. Mom immediately reached for it. "That document isn't valid," Rebecca's voice answered from the doorway. It absolutely was. Every person in the room turned. She stepped inside carrying another folder. I was invited today, she said evenly. Emily thought someone should be here to explain the paperwork. Grant looked like he wanted to argue. Instead, he stayed silent. Rebecca calmly pointed toward the will. I drafted that document personally. She looked directly at Mom. Walter never instructed me to remove Emily as beneficiary. Nobody had an answer. I reached into my folder one last time. My fingers rested on the folded letter Walter had left inside the cedar box. I unfolded it carefully. I won't read the entire letter, I said. It was personal. I swallowed before continuing. But there's one part everyone should hear. My voice almost broke as I read his words. If you're holding this, Emily, then things probably didn't happen the way I hoped. Don't waste your strength arguing with people. Let the documents speak. Truth doesn't need the loudest voice. It only needs time. I lowered the letter. Nobody moved. Nobody even looked at me anymore. They were all staring at Walter's handwriting. Dad covered his face with one hand. Grant looked down at the floor. Mom's lips trembled, but no words came out. For the first time in months, I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel triumphant either. Mostly, I felt peaceful. Walter had trusted me from the beginning. Now everyone in the room finally understood why. I quietly gathered the copies I didn't need and closed the leather folder. I didn't come here to embarrass anyone, I said. I came because Walter deserved the truth. No one tried to stop me as I stood and walked toward the front door. Behind me, the silence was heavier than any argument could have been. 3 days later, Rebecca called. Her voice was calm. The probate court has opened a formal investigation. I closed my eyes for a moment. Everything Walter had told me echoed in my mind. Let the documents speak. Now, they finally would. The investigation moved a lot slower than I expected. Real life usually does. There weren't dramatic arrests or instant confessions. There were interviews, handwriting experts, financial records, and months of paperwork. Rebecca stayed involved the entire time. In the end, the evidence spoke louder than anyone at our Thanksgiving table ever had. The later will was declared invalid. Walter's original will, the one Rebecca had prepared years earlier, was officially restored. Grant became the focus of the investigation into the forged documents. I never asked what happened during those interviews. Whatever he had to say belonged in court, not with me. Mom wasn't accused of writing the false will, but the court ordered her to return the inheritance she had received from it. Since the orchard had already been sold, untangling the money took time. A few months later, Grant's brand new truck was gone. Dad called me only once. I should have read what I signed, he said quietly. I know. I'm sorry. I believed he meant it. But forgiveness and trust aren't the same thing. Mom never apologized. She wrote one short letter saying she still believed she'd done what was best for the family. I didn't answer. There wasn't anything left to argue about. Instead, I went back to the orchard. The first season wasn't easy. Several rows of apple trees had been neglected. Equipment needed repairs, the farmhouse needed work, and the books were a mess. Luckily, numbers have always made more sense to me than people. Little by little, the orchard came back to life. Former workers returned. Neighbors stopped by with advice. Some even volunteered to help repair old fences because they wanted Walter's orchard to survive. One afternoon, I unlocked the barn with the brass key Walter had given me. The place still smelled like old wood, dust, and apples. Inside a cabinet, I found Walter's work hat. The fabric was faded and the brim was stained from years in the sun. I smiled. Instead of taking it home, I hung it on the same hook beside the workshop door where he'd always left it. It felt right. I stepped outside and looked across the rows of apple trees. Fresh green leaves were covering branches that had looked lifeless only months before. The orchard wasn't perfect. Neither was my family. Some relationships never recovered. Holiday gatherings became smaller. Phone calls became rare. Life simply kept moving. That's when I realized my biggest victory had never been about owning the orchard. It was making sure Walter's true wishes weren't erased. Someone had tried to rewrite his story. They almost succeeded. But the truth was still there, waiting in the right documents until someone was willing to look. I stood quietly beside the barn, watching the breeze move through the apple trees. For the first time in a long while, everything felt peaceful, almost like Walter had trusted this moment would come. If this story meant something to you, I hope it reminds you that truth doesn't always arrive quickly, but it's worth protecting. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stay patient and let the facts speak for themselves. If you've ever experienced family conflict or a time when doing the right thing took longer than expected, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, please share it with someone who might relate, and subscribe for more family drama stories. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.